Hi, I'm Sarah Light, Agronomy Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension. I'm here today with my co-host, Liz Harper, the Executive Director of the Colusa County Resource Conservation District. Our guest today is a colleague of mine, Konrad Mathesius. He's also an Agronomy Advisor with the University of California, and he has been doing some work on biosolids. It's really a pleasure to have Konrad on our show today. He'll be introducing us to a new topic. It's a little bit less researched than some of the other soil health topics we've covered, and we're really excited about it. Welcome, Konrad. Konrad.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, Konrad, can you start by giving us a general introduction to biosolids? What are they and how are they classified?
Yeah, so biosolids have been around for a while, but they are generally, they come in a couple different forms. It's essentially sewage sludge, but it's been treated. And this is material that's coming from municipal waste streams. And as I said, treated or digested in a way that reduces the pathogen loads to kind of acceptable levels. And then it's also tested to ensure that metals that might cause plant damage or that might accumulate over time, such as lead or chromium, things like that, even copper, that they're below certain thresholds. And that then gets funneled into different classes of biosolids. You've got class B, which typically require permits, class A that don't necessarily and then you've got class A exceptional quality. And as you go, from class B to class A exceptional quality, you're getting decreasing pathogen loads. I think the idea with class A is that, according to the EPA's material on this, is that there's no pathogens are going to be introduced to the field. It's basically sterile when it's actually introduced into the environment. No harmful pathogens will be out there, or an insignificant number. Whereas class B, there are reentry permits and such as well, that because there are going to be some pathogens out there for a while, but they're expected to kind of die off as they kind of integrate into the soil, microbial environment.
And is that because of the kind of point of origin of the material, or because of the treatment of the material?
Yeah, so that typically, I think it could be both, but ultimately, if we're talking about pathogen loads, it's treatment, right? So the largest thing, a lot of times they're aerobically or anaerobically digested. In the case of the material that we're working with Listec, it's pasteurized. So I think there are several ways that you can arrive at that, but ultimately they're just looking at coliform essentially, and metals. And metals would then obviously probably be from source material, because you can't really cook metals out. You can't digest metals out. So that's source material. And if you have more industrial byproducts coming down the line, through your municipal waste streams, that might make it more difficult, but that's why they're checking these things along the way. Yeah. Yes.
So what is the regulatory framework for biosolids, and is it legal to use biosolids in California? And are the regulations universal across all cropping types?
Yeah, so that's a complicated discussion, but I think what I can say with certainty is that the EPA, the state, and the county all have their own regulatory bodies that kind of regulate biosolids along that chain. And locally, typically, at least in Solano County and in Sacramento County, they're managed ultimately by the health departments. So the Solano County Health Department, and the Solano County Health Department, in the case of Solano, would be partnering with the State Water Resources Control Board to kind of issue permits for something like a Class B, or coordinate kind of the requirements for a Class A, and do inspection and testing and stuff along the way where it needs to happen. So legally they're all available. Like I said, Class B does require a permit. Class A, they're exempt. But ultimately, the best thing to do for anyone looking to work with them would be to reach out to some of the suppliers, such as Listec or Denali Water Solutions, or Synagro. And they'll have people on board who, their job it is to make sure that everything's kind of being done the way it should be done, that it fits it into the regulatory framework. For the cropping systems themselves, I'm not entirely sure. I know there's been, and this is, I wasn't able to find straight answers on this just yet, but my understanding is that they can use it for, if it's class A, then let me not say anything about that without being entirely sure. But there may be some distinction about between crops that actually might come in contact with the soil surface versus crops that might be harvested above the soil surface. Compare, say tomatoes to wheat. And then there are also issues with marketing where people might not want, or suppliers may not want to buy that material from growers if they've used biosolids. But that's something that I think a grower could talk about with their buyers ahead of time and kind of work that out when they're setting up their contracts. So yeah.
Interesting, very interesting. Thanks. So you've been doing some research trials and you've collected a great amount of data over the past couple of years on the impact of biosolid application compared to some of our more typical conventional fertilizers. I've seen some of your results. They're really interesting. I was hoping you could share some of those with our audience and talk a little bit about why you've chosen to do this exploratory research with this kind of type of soil amendment.
So first, I'll explain a little bit about what we're actually working with Listek. It's Listek, and they're based out of Solano, and that's classified as a Class A biosolid. Occasionally, they've been Class A exceptional quality, but I think there was some material they were getting that was not anaerobically digested. There was some technical reasons they went into Class A, but they'll probably go back to a Class A exceptional quality again. But essentially, it's a liquid injected fertilizer that based in this based in biosolids, derived from biosolids. They pasteurize it and they add buffering agents to it, calcium, potassium, to kind of balance out some of the acidity that comes from that. And so that is then, so once it's been processed, pasteurized and whatnot, they bring it out to the field, they'll inject it, they'll open up a trench about 6 inches deep with coulters. They'll inject into that ground and then cover it back up underneath that. There's a few other formats out there. I think Synagro is using pelletized stuff, but it's important that any of the kind of conclusions I'm making here are based on just using Listek. In the future, we'll probably work with some of the pelletized processors or other forms of biosolids out there to see if we're seeing major differences. We're a little limited in what we can look at. So the reason why we're doing this, though, is it's a locally available resource. This is what growers in my counties would have access to. This is one of them coming from the Solano waste stream, and some of their material comes from the Bay Area as well. There's some potential for slow release in that it is ultimately organic material, not organic certification, but we're talking about it's derived from biological materials that come out of these municipal waste streams. And that because it has organic matter in it, it may release a little slower, and I would assume slower than a conventional fertilizer. In some of the cropping systems up here, you might not be able to get into your fields to top dress with urea or ammonium. You might have to fly on, or if in the case of a lot of the acreage down in Rio Vista where they have all those windmills, you can't fly that stuff on, and if you get kind of muddy ground, you can't drive anything on either. And so typically we recommend people would do an in-season top dress fertilization for nitrogen. But this, as an organic material, might have a little bit slower release, which would give them essentially, if they couldn't get in there, an additional nitrogen pool to kind of work off. And then ultimately, long term, the 30,000 foot view is that we're closing waste streams. We're like closing that nutrient cycle. A lot of this stuff otherwise gets turned into a cake or a sludge that we would just throw in the landfill. That's an expense that the counties have to pay for, as a disposal fee. And instead, in this case, it can be some of that disposal fee can be used to offset the cost of getting it out there, and the growers end up paying close to, per unit of nitrogen, pound of nitrogen per acre, they're getting close to what they would get for a lot of the conventional synthetic fertilizers. And so that's kind of why we were looking at it. Now, as the results go, what we're seeing, and we looked at a couple things. We looked at what was happening, snapshots of where are we accumulating organic matter over the course of a season, and the answer is we're not. We're not seeing a significant difference, but you are injecting organic matter into that system, and so it's going somewhere. And so there's probably an uptick in microbial activity, but we can't really make any conclusions about that. But what we did see, things we could measure were yield and nitrogen use efficiency. And in both cases, they were the same or insignificantly different or slightly better than the using a conventional synthetic fertilizer. Now, that is comparing, so we're comparing apples to apples, total nitrogen applied via a biosolid. So we're talking 4,000 gallons of biosolids, which is like 5%, 3 to 5% dry matter, total nitrogen. And so you can work out, you can do the math on that, and you get, so 90, let's say we get 90 pounds of nitrogen through biosolids. We saw that if you had 90 pounds of nitrogen coming from synthetic fertilizers, that you're getting comparable yields. And so that could be the fact that could be because it's all becoming available rather quickly. But that's another thing. Those are like questions moving forward. We're not entirely sure. Is it because this material is becoming readily available, or is it because you're adding organic matter to the system and it's stimulating the turnover of organic matter that already exists in the system? The microbes are gobbling up organic matter because you've injected a bunch of carbon in there, and they're making nitrate more available throughout the system. We're not sure what's causing that, and that would be future steps of looking at incubations in the lab, and looking at release curves, nitrogen release curves, and things like that. But the bottom line is, pound for pound, the nitrogen you're adding with biosolids and the nitrogen you're adding with the conventional fertilizer seem to be about the same in terms of their performance. And in doing so, you also get a little bit of potassium, a little bit of phosphorus. And so we can talk a little bit about that, perhaps, like how we want to use it strategically, what that means for the growers. But this is just giving us a better idea of what you can expect when you use this stuff.
Can you talk about what cropping systems you've trialed this in?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is when I say the yield, we need to make it clear, this is winter grains. And so far we've done 3 years, but one of our years was eaten by sheep that got in a little earlier, so we couldn't get the yield off of them, but it was wheat. Wheat is what we have. We have 2 years of what we call winter wheat, technically spring wheats, that don't do fertilization. But yeah, I have the California version of winter wheat. We're planting in November, and we're harvesting in late May, mid-June, depending on the situation. And we have a 3rd year of data that's coming in now. We haven't had time to get the protein numbers back, which is what we're using as a proxy for nitrogen uptake, and allows us to make those comparisons.
Great. And what time of year are you applying the biosolids? Is it in the fall planting, or? Yeah,
biosolids are before planting, and so that's one of the constraints for sure, is that you really can't go in and top dress with biosolids. Certainly not on something like tomatoes mid-season, but if you're going to do it, you kind of got to do it beforehand. Yeah, and with this particular liquid injection system, it's kind of integrated fairly quickly, and yeah.
So it looks like you have some good work ahead of you and good data to launch from. So bringing it back to the farm, where would you start? Where do you get biosolids? We kind of briefly touched on the application method and the cropping types that you have experience with. But yeah, are there other application methods? And then just say anything else that a producer would need to know to apply a biosolid to their farm.
Yeah, so the first thing would be to contact the folks who they're going to be selling the material to, and if see if there are objections to that. I mean, that's a discussion we all need to have about, like, what needs to be required, or what the just a better understanding of pathogen loads and metals and what that actually means to the crops, and looking at uptake and stuff like that within the crop. We do have some data on that though, and that, you know, these are like regulated materials that kind of indicate that they're safe to consume. But talk to your contracts, because you've got to be able to sell this at the end of the day. The first step otherwise though would be speaking to some of the suppliers, and in the area, like I said, it would be Listec, Denali Water Solutions, or Synagro, depending on the area you're at. And they're, like I said, they've got some of them, they're all coming in different forms. Some of them are injected, some of them are pelletized. And like I said, my data only speaks to the injected stuff so far. And I think because it's injected with water and stuff, it may behave a little differently. But the main thing is that you can sell your product at the end of the day. And but talking to some of the specialists, you know, at those companies, they'll be able to work out kind of what your nitrogen requirements would be, and help you make sure that if you need permitting for whatever, if they have Class B biosolids, and that's what would be the best fit for your operation, that they'll get the permits, they can get that stuff lined up and make sure that you're working, checking off all the boxes that you need to do. So that would be my first recommendation. And if you have questions about nutrient loading and you know, NP and K, that's stuff that I can, you know, we can talk about. You can call me personally, I'm based in Woodland, or you can also just look at some of their printouts. They typically have lab reports of their material that will have NP and K expressed in, you know, the numerical format that we're all kind of familiar with looking at a fertilizer bag. So as total N, as P2O, was it phosphate, and then K2O.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I had one more kind of follow-up question.
Sure.
When we're talking about the systems and the practicality of it, as we consider the expansion of this type of soil amendment in our system, do you anticipate that the farmers that are going to have access to this product are mostly going to be those near kind of urban centers? Because I imagine they're pretty heavy and transportation costs are pretty difficult. So is this sort of like how in areas closer to dairies, they have access to more dairy waste application? Do you anticipate that being the case with this, or do you think it's going to be more of this pelletized, we're moving it around like a lightweight thing, or is it too soon to kind of tell what the market's going to be in the future?
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to, it's going to come down to whether or not there's still funding for the disposal of that sewage sludge, and a lot of that will probably come from even regulators and legislators understanding the potential value that comes from closing our waste streams. I think that palletized stuff would make more sense, obviously, to go a little bit farther, you know, longer distance, but there's energy required to remove that. All that dewatering requires energy. Is that more energy than the energy required to transport large amounts of liquefied material? I'm not sure. That's some of the math I haven't done yet. But I would assume that you would, if this kind of took off and became more ubiquitous in the United States, which it already is used fairly widely in places like Europe and parts of Asia, that it's a fairly normalized thing. And that, I think that's the trend you would see, though, is ideally you'd see pelletized forms of stuff going to the rural areas and over longer distances. And that would behave differently, perhaps, in terms of the breakdown of that material and the availability of the nutrients in that material. But I think, yeah.
Awesome.
All right, I just have to ask, and we could edit this out later, but just kind of talk about the odor. Does it have a scent?
So this is actually an important point, though, because I think that regardless of all the legality of, like, are you allowed to apply it, even if it's Class A, exceptional quality, there are city councils that are going to be receptive to smell complaints. And even though this stuff is already, a lot of the stuff is sterile, dead, essentially, it's been boiled down, it's got some leftover stuff in there that's going to smell. And boy, yeah, I think I mentioned it. I mentioned it in conversation the other day. I get some on my shoe, and it just just like ingrained into the rubber. Now the field itself didn't smell bad after a couple of weeks, like a week even, and I was out in the middle of it. It was fine. But yeah, it does. I think that's the microbes doing their job and like breaking it down, and like, but if it's on my shoe, it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. I don't know. So there is that, and that's why, yeah. So those are other things to consider that go above and beyond just the basic regulatory pathogen and metals requirements.
Right. Well, well, Konrad, this has been a really informative interview.